Hello, fellow cooperators. Good morning and welcome to the Capital track of Up and Coming 2021. My name is Jacqueline Hanna and I'm the Assistant Director of Food Co-op Initiative. And this is our frame setter session. I'm very honored to be here to kind of set up the day and help us know where we're going with this topic of capital today. Where are startups with this topic? What's going on with capital and startup food co-ops? Where are we heading? So hopefully I'm going to be able to frame a little bit of that and set off our day. The name of the session, of this frame setter session, is Tectonic Realignment, the now and future of funding our food co-ops. I'll talk a little bit more about that unusual name choice in just a little bit. First off, let's understand what this day is about. Capital, this is a dictionary definition, is wealth in the form of money or other assets owned by a person or organization, or that is available or contributed for a particular purpose, such as starting a company or investing. Now, we are going to use the word capital as pretty synonymous with financial capital or money throughout this session and most of the capital track. But please do keep in mind capital and the capital that we bring to our startup food co-ops is more than just the dollars. The dollars, though, are critical. But the capital we bring is also human capital, time capital, talent capital. There's all sorts of types of capital. We're going to focus a lot on the financial type right now. And the reason is this financial capital stuff, it's actually pretty core to what a food co-op is, almost in every way. Why do we build food co-ops? What do they do? I like to call them economic engines for change. So we raise a whole bunch of money and capital to build a brick and mortar food co-op grocery store that is open to the public. And the public then brings those dollars in that they would usually spend on groceries somewhere else, and they bring them to the co-op. And as their dollars or capital are poured through this co-op that was built with community capital, their capital is transformed into a new form of capital, a form of capital that then leaves the co-op as a vision, our collective vision. That money, those resources that they pour in, that we all pour in, owning the co-op, shopping at the co-op, participating in the co-op, then grow our collective vision, become community capital, community wealth, community jobs, community access, all sorts of different types of community capital. Really, at the very core of it, one could argue that the whole cooperative model is about taking capital out of the hands of corporations and organizations that would use it, would take it out of our community and use it to make themselves wealthier, and instead take that capital, which originally belonged to us, and invest it in building this economic engine that allows us to change and shape our community in ways that enrich all of us and empower us together. So capital is at the core, the very core of what it is to be a cooperative and a food cooperative very specifically. And it's an alternative model, and it's a way to create really powerful, meaningful change that is back in the hands of the people. The thing is, this whole idea of capital, when I was thinking about it, what's going on with capital, with funding our startup food co-ops? What's going on right now? And the answer is a lot. The answer is we don't completely know. The answer is not as certain as it was 3, 4, 5 years ago. That's why I brought up this title, Tectonic Realignment. The reason I brought, you remember this concept, tectonic plates? See, I learned about it in grade school. I haven't learned anything about it since, so forgive me if this is a very rudimentary recitation of what I remember. But tectonic plates to me were kind of an amazing concept when I learned about them, because I thought of the Earth's crust, and the Earth itself is solid, stable, rarely changing, this old ancient thing that just was the way it was. And then I found out it's actually this Earth we stand on top of, this crust is a crust. And that crust is made up of tectonic plates. And these plates are floating on top of massive amounts of lava And they're not only floating on top of the lava, they're moving around, they're living, moving, covering each other, rubbing up against each other, pounding against each other, creating different forces, moving different directions. That it's actually this crust that we stand on, that I thought was this eternal thing that had been here forever and was solid and never changed, is in constant movement, is in constant change, is constantly pushing different forces up against each other and creating new land, new formations, that it's never static. And that's why I thought of this concept of tectonic realignment that was so amazing to me as a child, and honestly, it still is today, when I was thinking about capital and funding our startup food co-ops. Because what I would have said to you about, here's how you raise the capital for a startup food co-op. This is generally where the sources are and how we use it and how much money you'll need. And these are the banks and these are the lenders and that will usually work with you. And this is how you do an owner loan campaign. And all of that's changed, or a whole heck of a lot of it. A whole heck of a lot of it. Things have moved. The tectonic plates that we thought was the stable concept of how food co-ops are funded have shifted, have moved, have created new formations. So that's the metaphor I'm working with today, is that this isn't a stable thing where capital comes from today, that it's in change, it's in flux. But to tell this story of these tectonic plates of funding startup food co-ops crashing, moving, rubbing against each other, groaning, creating new things in the last 5 years or so, we have to have a little bit of history. We have to know where this all comes from. So forgive me, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to tell you just a little bit of a story about capital and startup food co-ops. Now, the following information is through the lens of what we've seen at Food Co-op Initiative over the last 15 years of working with hundreds of startup food co-ops across the country, 150 of which have opened in those 15 years. And so it comes from the trends we're noticing from the co-ops we've worked with. Now, keep in mind, though, there are definitely startup food co-ops out there that have organized without interacting with Food Co-op Initiative, some of which didn't know about us and didn't interact with. Some knew about us, but felt the model that they saw us predominantly working in maybe wasn't a fit for their community, which was valid. So the information is from that very specific lens. That said, let's take a look at the waves of food co-op history. It's always talked about as waves because there have been times of large amounts of food co-ops being organized that just larger than any other time that kind of ebb and flow. The first big wave of startup food co-op organizing was in the 1940s. This is when the whole concept of the modern grocery store was really created, and coming out of the Great Depression, people wanted to control their own businesses, their own economic futures, and their vision was, their specific way of delivering that vision was through a mission of building these newfangled grocery stores and owning them and controlling them themselves. So the Great Depression led to this desire for economic control. The second wave of startup food co-ops came out of the tumultuous late 60s and was very focused also on the vision of economic self-empowerment and control, but the way they wanted to deliver that, the mission they were focused on, was different. Many of the food co-ops organized at this time were focused on creating access to healthy food and economic self-empowerment in BIPOC-led communities that had been affected for decades by economic redlining and all sorts of crushing policies that had held their communities back and harmed them. They wanted control for themselves. They wanted to run their own businesses, invest their money in those businesses, spend their money at those businesses to create what they needed for themselves. And that was a big drive for food co-ops in that time, to create access and economic and racial justice. At the same time, the food system itself has massively changed over the last couple decades before this, and we've seen the creation of the modern food system with mega farms, corporations, sprayed chemicals, and people are beginning to realize they want something different, that this isn't healthy. This new food system is not healthy for the environment, it's not healthy for our communities, for the workers, or for us as individuals taking in that food, and they want to create an alternate food system and invest in a different way of interacting with how their food is grown and how their food is raised and what they eat. So that's the second wave of food co-ops happening in the 1970s. And from that are most of the food co-ops you know about today. If you've been in a food co-op, which is considered kind of the typical food co-op today, it was probably a second wave food co-op that actually developed in the late 60s or in the 70s. That, what we think of the food co-ops today, started there. Now, the third wave of food co-op organizing explodes in the early 2000s. Actually, it was the phones of the second wave food co-ops that were ringing off the hook with communities saying, we want what you have. We see this powerful model. We see the good you're doing in your community. We see how you're helping to support and build an alternate food economy that is healthier, is better for farmers in the world, and we want that too. So this third wave of startup food co-ops starts in the early 2000s. And if you're here today, you are part of this third wave. The third wave is still active. We are in the third wave of food co-op organizing in the US. And it started with communities that saw second wave food co-ops and the specific way they were delivering their mission in their communities, and they wanted the same thing. They wanted not only the focus on local foods, organic foods, and so forth, they wanted stores that looked like, that felt like, that were a lot like those second wave co-ops. They were inspired by that and just wanted it in their community as well. So that is most of the startup food co-ops that FCI saw for the first 7-8 years of its existence. And FCI was actually created by the second wave co-ops and their supporters specifically to address this, to help all these startups that were calling them and help them figure out how to start co-ops like theirs, modeled on their co-ops. And so that's very much where all the focus was on that. And then in the middle of this third wave, which we're currently still in, there's some rumblings of the tectonic plates, right? Some change is starting to come, some really interesting dynamic change and some challenging changes. We'll talk about some of the more challenging ones going forward, but one of the more dynamic, exciting ones was that who was showing up at the National Startup Food Co-op conferences, at FCI trainings, was starting to change. It was not just communities that wanted to focus on the second wave mission style of food co-op. It was also starting to be a lot of BIPOC-led startup food co-ops and organizers who were organizing together, coming together to build food co-ops that were culturally appropriate for their communities and focused on their mission and what they saw as predominantly important. Yes, part of that was building food access, as it always is for all of us, but they were really focused in on racial and economic justice for their communities and saw food co-ops as a way to get there. Very much like some of the startups from the second wave of startup food co-ops. Now, throughout this rest of this presentation, you're going to sometimes hear me reference these BIPOC-led racial and economic justice focused startups as the new mission third wave food co-ops. And what I mean by that is new to the third wave. It was new that we had this huge dynamic influx of these BIPOC-led startup food co-ops in the part of the food co-op movement that FCI was part of, and that we were aware of. Suddenly there was this influx and this dynamic change. And so I call them the new mission startup food co-ops because new to the third wave was this mission, this focus. But in no way is Black or BIPOC-led food cooperation a new thing. It was happening in the 1970s and probably long before that. So when I reference it as new, I mean new only to the third wave, that there were so many of them in such force with such dynamic organizing going on. So as we talked about this model of capital, we've got the capital we have to raise to build and open the food co-op. That's what most of you are focused on right now. Then we've got the capital that comes in through offering the right products, from knowing our customers, knowing if they want, building a store that meets their shopping patterns. And then we have that capital coming through the co-op builds community capital, and that meets our vision, whatever that collective vision of the community is. And from about the early 2000s to around 2016, the model was not only consistent. So there's a model of startup food co-ops, And then there's a way you deliver the model. The vision is the broad thing we exist to accomplish. And we find both before 2016 and after, but startup food co-ops all have very similar visions and goals. They want to enrich their community, improve their community, keep wealth in their community, improve the food system and access to that food for everybody. That's pretty consistent no matter where you're organizing. But the mission of a food co-op is how we're going to manifest the vision. And those second wave food co-ops manifested a very particular way with certain types of product offerings, with certain types of main goals and focuses, and the way the store smells and the way it's organized and how they serve the customers. That's a particular mission, a way of seeing how to deliver that broader vision that all food co-ops today pretty much agree on. But how we choose to deliver it can be very different co-op to co-op. So, but it wasn't really from the early 2000s to around 2016. Almost every startup food co-op, not every, but almost every startup food co-op wanted their mission, their picture for what the store would look like and how it would deliver their community vision was pretty much what they had at the second wave food co-ops. They wanted something extremely similar. They saw how wonderful that was, what it did for the community, and they wanted that. They saw the focus on organic foods, on sustainable foods, on local foods, and they wanted that. And their products were pretty much, the goal was the same, and the people they were going to serve were very similar. So we kind of knew from 2000 to 2016 kind of exactly what people needed to know. We had information from the existing co-ops, and all the startups through this third wave up to that point were organizing in basically the same concept. So we knew about capital in startup food co-ops. It was solid. It was the ground we stood on. It was, in some ways, absolutely trusted and eternal. We'll get to the tectonic plate part later. But what seems solid to us about capital? Okay, so this capital to build our startup food co-ops. Sources and uses. This is basic pro forma stuff if you're new to this. Basically, where will you source the money to build your food co-op? And how will you need to use it to build your food co-op? And there were some standards that were pretty universal, and they had been, again, from the early 2000s until around 2016. So we knew that the sources would be half owner portion basically, and half external sources. So when I mean owner's portion, I mean the owner's equity, the equity we pay in to become owners, owner members, that owner equity would be a big chunk of the owner's portion. And grants and donations, there wouldn't be a ton, but there'd be some grants and donations, and that money would play into our sources. And then owner loans. And I don't mean preferred shares or DPO, or I meant owner loans. At the time, that's what everyone did. We knew there would be an owner loan campaign, and the significant amount, the largest portion of the owner's portion of the sources would come through owner loans. And we knew how you run those owner loan campaigns, and we knew they would work in your community if run this way with this many owners in general. It was pretty clear cut, and it was consistent. We also knew that the rest of the money would have to come from these external sources, and that the primary lender would play a significant role. They would get all the collateral. So they had first rights on if anything were to happen to the co-op, all of the things it owned, all of its equipment, everything, anything financial resources it had, anything of value would go to that primary lender until they were paid back, till they were made whole. And they got the collateral, and they lent you a good chunk of money for that. And then there would be a gap between, so here's all the owner portion and all the ways they've brought together money. Here's the primary lender. And then there wouldn't be quite enough to match how much money you needed for the uses. But we would fill that gap almost always pretty consistently with a secondary lender who asked for no collateral. It was an uncollateralized loan, unsecured. That would be for a smaller amount by far, but was often available, especially through cooperative lenders for startup food co-ops. Why? Because from early 2000 to around 2016, these projects, if they followed the model and followed the steps correctly, and there was a strong market study and so forth, they opened and they performed as expected or darn close. And so there was this consistency of success. And so lenders who consistently worked with startup food co-ops knew the model, knew how these market studies went, knew the kind of audience, knew the type of community, and felt confident. And so to the extent that we even had some lenders that would come in for smaller amounts and fill gaps with no collateral at all. The uses side, we were very clear that 50 to 60% of the project would be the cost of building out the store, these whole improvements and equipment. And then there would be, some for inventory, about 5%, professional fees, about 5%, startup promotionals, other little stuff, and then working capital and overrun allowance. But it was all, we kind of knew exactly what it would cost. We were building the same kinds of stores, and all you had to do was plug in the square feet of the total store, and you had a pretty accurate number. So this was solid. This was the foundation of how we understood capitalizing our startup food co-ops. But some other things about capital that we were very certain about. Remember, I mentioned we were certain, we knew what kind of person was going to show up. We knew that the market study was looking for certain education levels, certain income levels, because those tended to be the people that spent the most money at the type of food co-op we were opening with the type of offerings we were offering. We knew a lot about how they wanted to shop, what they wanted to shop. That was also consistent, how we were going to get those shopping dollars, that capital through the co-op to meet its financial needs and produce a surplus that would then go through the co-op and feed its vision, right? Feed the vision. And and in this case, we knew even specifically how most startup food co-op communities were going to want that vision to manifest in the mission. They were going to want specifically, yes, we want more capital reinvested in our community. We want a stronger food system, but the specific ways they wanted that to look was usually they wanted more money going back to farmers and local food in the local food system. They wanted more money pouring through the co-op and making available organic foods and sustainable foods, fair trade foods. There was a very specific way that most communities that wanted a startup food co-op wanted that community enrichment and that food system to manifest. And that's where all of this capital to build the store, and then the shopper capital from those stereotypical shoppers that we knew basically who they were going to be, this is what their money was going to do. It was going to grow the local food system, go back to local farmers. It was going to make available more organic food, the specific concept of healthy, fair trade, sustainable food. This all felt very solid. The chain of how we brought the capital in to start up the food co-op, how the capital would pour in from customers and owners, and how it would be utilized to manifest the vision was consistent, was pretty darn consistent, and we knew how it worked. And it can't be said that 100% of startups that followed the model were successful, but it was pretty close if you closely followed the model and had a reasonably strong market study. So what happens? That's 15 years almost of, somewhere around there, of this model being manifested a very specific way, and the capital comes in a certain way, and it moves through a certain way, and it creates this kind of community wealth, ta-da, and we know it's solid, and we know how to train people on it. Well, there were some cracks starting to show up about 5-6 years ago, but they were small. Really what we had, in my opinion, is a monoculture. You see here a field of corn. These co-ops were wonderful. Corn is good nourishment for the body and does all sorts of things for us. But we had co-ops with very, very similar missions and customer bases, and kind of producing the same type of co-op as second wave food co-ops. Again, wonderful food co-ops, but all very similar missions and customers, and everything was sunny and bright. But the cracks that started to show up, very subtle ones, were project costs for these, what I will call second wave mission co-ops. So it's third wave, but the second wave mission focused. They wanted a second wave food co-op store, in their community doing great things. Those were starting to see project costs going up and up, and to an extent that you couldn't just go out and get more loans necessarily, because the co-op financial model couldn't take on that much debt. So as the costs are going up, we're starting to have to raise more and more money through owner loans to match that. We're starting to get a little more in grants. So we're noticing that, but co-ops are rising to the challenge. They're raising a little more owner loan money. They're finding a few grants, nothing to panic about. Another crack was there were new communities organizing food co-ops. These communities didn't look like this cornfield, nor did their idea of how to manifest the vision and what they wanted to accomplish. Would the model we have work in their communities? No one was quite sure yet. And that uncertainty started to make people aware, maybe something's changing. Things were definitely changing. Those tectonic plates moved and shifted and pushed and rumbled. And what we saw very soon after, about 5 years, about 4 or 5 years ago, is that some second wave mission startups, the type that we had been building since the early 2000s, ones that were expected to be rock stars. They had organized by the model, they had raised the money, they were expected to open out of the gate successful. They were opening and struggling, floundering. By an amount we'd never seen before. They weren't off sales by 5%, it was far more. It was far, far more. They were in danger of closing. What's going on? What happened to that solid ground of how we understand capital and how we understand how money moves through our food co-op to make our startups successful? At the same time, startups that were opening with a new mission that didn't look like second wave food co-ops, that weren't opening in communities that second wave food co-ops often opened in, they were giving it a try. They were doing incredible organizing, and they were getting a couple stores open under some different ways of manifesting the vision, very different kinds of stores, and they weren't succeeding. There was a lot of panic. So what happened? What was different? Let's look at the pure financial capital part of it. What was going on about 4 years ago? What was changing about how we fund our projects and how much it costs to run our projects and open our stores? So what was changing? What was happening in capital about 4 or 5 years ago? Even for these early third wave, second wave mission type startups that we had been, give or take, pretty much consistently opening since the early 2000s, quite successfully. What was happening to capital for them that was shaking the earth underneath us and making us realize that capital foundation, that ground maybe wasn't so solid? Well, pretty rapidly, we saw these unsecured loans, this gap financing disappearing, because some startup food co-ops that seemed to be sure wins, sure bets, weren't being successful for the first time ever, and lenders were understandably getting nervous. They also had been funding some of these terrific new mission, new way of seeing, new community food co-ops, and those weren't going so good. And lenders were like, what is going on? They are feeling the rumblings. And so unsecured loans start disappearing. So now our sources has a gap. How are we going to fill that gap? One of the things you might notice is the primary lender box shrunk. The primary lenders who did stay involved with funding startup food co-ops also saw the trends and what had been happening and started being willing to lend a lot less money for the same amount of collateral, because they're realizing they might actually have to liquidate that collateral to get their loan back. There might be a couple failures. It could happen. And so suddenly the amount they were willing to lend for the amount of collateral that startup food co-ops have available was shifting. Also, we have this big gap, but there's another problem. At the same time, the costs of building these stores was rapidly heading up. Now, it had always been heading up, eking its way up and up and up, but it suddenly got a lot more rapid. So now we have this gap. We don't know who's going to do the gap financing, and the gap is even bigger because we need more money than we used to open these stores. And our pro formas were already pretty delicately balanced. We couldn't really afford more debt. The co-op couldn't generate enough sales and income to pay more debt. So how are we going to get more money and fill this gap without using more debt? It was a little scary. Then, if you looked at the startups that were starting to open, and let's be clear, these are co-ops that were opening in what the USDA calls a food desert. these were co-ops that were really opening in communities that were predominantly BIPOC, that had been historically redlined for decades, and were dealing with food apartheid. We're dealing with a lack of access to healthy food at a reasonable price that was not an accident, that was not natural, but was part of the whole trend of redlining communities. So these communities, while they had a great deal of capital, their financial capital was a lot less. The individual household financial capital wasn't there, wasn't available, despite the fact there was immense human talent capital available. And so owner loans, they can't do that. This model, this is the sources, this is how capital works, this is how we fund startup food co-ops. Owner loans, probably not going to work. There's not as much individual wealth in the individual households in these redlined communities who have lower incomes because of that history and that current. So owner loans are gone. Now what? Well, they also, the secondary unsecured loans, that was gone for everybody. So that's another gap suddenly. And primary lenders weren't sure. They hadn't seen this model before. They hadn't seen market studies for these communities before. They weren't so sure just how to predict if it would work. So were the primary lenders even going to be willing to finance food co-ops in these communities? So the sources gaps were immense, and they were up against the exact same increasing uses costs. That picture looked even more dire. So everything that seemed like a solid foundation from the early 2000s to around 2016, 2017, about how capital works for startup food co-ops in this third wave of startup food co-ops was kind of in tatters. The tectonic plates had shifted. They had moved. What we thought was a solid, this is the way and the way it's always going to work, wasn't like that anymore. Everything was up for question. Everything was changing about capital and what it cost and how we were going to put it together. Would it work anymore? Well, if what you've always done, you're like, it doesn't work anymore. Sometimes our human reaction is, well, it's all broken. This isn't going to work anymore. Startup food co-ops are over. We can't do this. It's over. And to say some people had maybe that feeling that they have just been through an earthquake and that the world of startup food co-ops capital was in tatters was to some extent understandable. But here's the thing. I don't believe these tectonic plates, this movement of the earth under us that was capital, the foundation of capital for our startup food co-ops, I don't believe we experienced an earthquake. I believe we experienced an eruption. And the thing about an eruption is that the skies go dark for a bit and you can't see. It's even hard to breathe. The explosion of change does break down many things that we held solid and certain. There were casualties, but the thing about volcanoes is their eruption creates some of the most fertile soil in the entire world. Their heat unlocks seeds that were just waiting to bloom and creates lush and resilient diversity, something we didn't really have in the third wave of startup food co-ops up to this point. And I'm talking specifically financial diversity, as well as diversity of who was at the table, which communities were building. So lava has leveled everything, but there's rich soil. This is not the scene of an earthquake destroying and bringing down everything and making it nigh impossible to rebuild and just harming the movement. This is now fertile soil. So from this moment of panic, how are we going to fund these startup food co-ops anymore? Can we even do it? Came solutions, came innovation. So after all these tales of financing gaps, rising costs, after listening to all this, can startup food co-ops really get fully capitalized? I mean, Jacqueline, that was a pretty little story about the volcano and all this rich soil coming out of it, but can we actually raise the money? How are we going to capitalize our startup food co-ops now? Well, first, let's answer the question, can it be done? The answer to that is yes. You are looking at the pictures of 3 food co-ops that have opened in the last 6 months. South Philly Food Co-op opened fully capitalized on December 24th of 2020 and opened their doors the day before Christmas, snow on the ground, successful. They are currently meeting their sales projections. Fredericksburg Food Co-op in Fredericksburg, Virginia, opened their doors on April 2nd of this year and is currently meeting sales projections, fully capitalized. Gem City Market of Dayton, Ohio, the beloved Gem City, opened its doors this week, fully capitalized, raising over $7 million to open their store, only $1 million of that as debt. And we look forward to seeing those terrific sales numbers pouring in. So yes, there was this huge eruption and changes and disruption, but from it truly rich soil came, seeds were planted, and people found new ways forward. Not only have these stores opened since that eruption, but also we have more stores coming. You have in the upper left here, the North Flint Food Market of Flint, Michigan, fully funded. They are breaking ground this summer on their store. This is an incredible story of how they got funded. I hope you'll hear more about that in one of our sessions this afternoon. Then we have the Oshkosh Food Co-op in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, fully funded. Also, we'll be sharing an innovative story about how they got to their point of fully funded, how they raised their capital. They are looking to open late summer, early fall of this year. And the Detroit People's Food Co-op. Very, very, very close last I heard. I apologize, Detroit team, if you're listening and now you are fully capitalized, but I know you guys were certainly very close when I recorded this video, and we're in the process of finishing the purchase agreement on their land to build their food co-op, planning to break ground this summer. So even though the system, the pattern, the plan for capitalizing startup food co-ops that we had used for well over a decade during this third wave of startup food co-ops was no longer working for anyone the way that it was previously structured. Startup food co-ops didn't go away. Startup food co-ops innovated and grew. So let's take a minute and look at how they did it, because this is what we're really here to do today. I've told you this story of what seemed like the complete breaking down of what we knew, that actually was the recreation of how it's possible to capitalize startup food co-ops. And now we're to the point, now we're to where we can share some answers about how it's being done, how capitalizing startup food co-ops has changed. I'm going to give you a little short overview right now of how those sources and uses tabs are pulling together, where the sources are coming from, and how startup food co-ops are meeting the challenge of capitalization right now. So for early third wave style startup food co-ops, one I call the second wave model, the ones with open stores with a very similar way of delivering the vision as most second wave food co-ops, what were they going to do about this big gap that they now had? Well, you guys have been solving it. Fredericksburg Food Co-op not only decided they were going to up their owner goals, which they did significantly. They opened their store with over 2,000 owners, and usually a food co-op their size, even just maybe 2-3 years before, would have opened with 1,200. That brought in a whole flush of equity, of capital. But they also decided the other way they were going to close this gap was that they were going to go after much higher amounts of owner loans, and they were going to ask for longer terms. Instead of paying back owners their loans after 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, they were going to wait 10 years to give the co-op the opportunity to build up its economic and financial strength so it was able to pay those loans back. And it didn't raise 1 million in owner loans. It didn't even raise 1.6, which had been a record, 1.6 million in owner loans. Just a couple years before that, they raised $2.2 million in owner loans from that community, proving that when communities that have the economic resources to do so really want a food co-op, they will show up and they can fund that food co-op. Now, Oshkosh took a different tact, little less income in this community, and they were building their store again in what is called a USDA food desert. So they didn't necessarily, individual households maybe didn't have quite as much to lend. That wasn't a way they could solve it. They did increase, again, their owner goal and got in some of the cash, some of the financial money they needed for the project through that owner equity. But then they did something else. They said, what if, would this pro forma work? Could we get the capital we needed in a way that was sustainable and affordable to our co-op if 50% of the owner capital came in as donations? Up to this date, only very small portions of owner capital had come in as donations, if at all. They always came in through owner loans or very rarely preferred shares, but basically money that had to be paid back in some fashion. Oshkosh said, what if we take 50% of that off the table and we ask people to do 50% of this amount? Now I'm making this number in my head. I think it was 1.4 million, 50% of that as donations. And they did. They innovated, they changed, they took the rich soil beneath them, and they built a new solution to capital. What about our later third wave startups, the ones that are bringing forward new models and new missions in new communities? They couldn't have, remember the owner loan thing, that solution from Fredericksburg, that's not gonna work. The donations from Oshkosh directly from owners, not gonna work. Those secondary lenders are still missing, all these gaps are still there. How did they solve this? Remember, those gaps were even bigger. Well, they came forward with some incredible brilliance from the capital of their knowledge and the power of community. They organized and came up with new solutions. And one is Gem City Market. Gem City Market just opened this week, congratulations. And they raised owner equity, total amount from owners, all the cash and money from owners was $500,000. $4 million was brought in through grants and donations from all different types of sources. They worked very hard to find this money and bring that capital into their community. They also worked on new market tax credits, which is another tricky to explain form of financing that comes in as equity and does not have to be repaid if the project is successful. So this massive amount, look at all this, only $1 million of a $7 million project is actually primary lender debt. Incredible new solutions that they have built that their peers are learning from. And also look at later today, North Flint Food Market has raised an incredible amount through grants and donations, specifically grants though from all sorts of sources. The Detroit People's Food Co-op, similar project, great deal of money brought in new, innovative ways. There is a future to capital. It's happening right now. So coming up today after this session, all of our sessions will be about the concept of capital and taking you into much more depth on a lot of these topics that I only lightly touched on today. So right after this session will be a quick break, and then we have 3 sessions happening in the same time slot. One of them, the first one, why, how, when to add donations to your capital plans. This is with Oshkosh Food Co-op, and they're going to talk in more depth about how they approached raising half of their owner capital as donations instead of loans, and what you can do to repeat some of their success. Also happening during this time slot, we have Lauren Bell, who is the outreach manager for the Assabet Village Market, Assabet Co-op Market in Maynard, Massachusetts. And they recently ran a very successful owner loan campaign in the midst of some of the worst of the COVID epidemic. And part of their success was Lauren's approach. He's going to share with you why he believes in we own it, we fund it, that actually the opportunity to finance our own food co-ops, to raise the capital ourselves and to own our stores to that unique level, to really pay for it ourselves as much as possible, is actually one of the most exciting things about being a food co-op and a food co-op owner, that opportunity. Lauren has a really unique way of talking about it and a passion for it that you're going to hear in this session that really communicates how he prepared owners from way before they were ready for their owner loan campaign to understand that they would be helping to finance the store themselves, what that opportunity would look like, and why it was such a powerful and exciting thing. I absolutely recommend this session. He will convince you and give you some great messaging ideas on how to educate your community about funding their food co-op. Also during this time frame is a session with Don Moffitt of Don Moffitt of Kalunit, and he's doing financial sustainability from vision to reality. He'll be looking at how we put together those sources, how we put together a pro forma to both meet our vision and to be economically, financially sustainable. After that, we've got a little break for lunch, and then we'll be having our afternoon sessions, starting with vision, workshopping the impacts. This is with Don Moffitt again from Kalunit. He's going to take some of the concepts he talked about in the financial sustainability session and actually workshop them through with you. Now, remember, these workshop sessions have a limit of 50 people. The first 50 people who arrive get to be in that live workshop. And Don is actually going to workshop some pieces of looking at how your vision impacts the pro forma, impacts how you need to raise your capital, and the long-term impacts of it, and how you can balance both that vision of how you want to manifest your store, as well as financial sustainability for your startup, so it's there for years to come. Also during this time slot, we have pushing play on your pro forma. This is with Brittany Baird, also of Kalunit, and I'm excited about this one. For those of you who are further along, or maybe in stage 2B, on the horizon, you can see, at least from here, the possibility of that day of breaking ground. Brittany's going to talk about how that pro forma comes alive, that when you break ground, you start spending all that money from the pro forma to a whole new level, and that time matters. How the money is spent, execution of the build out of the store has real financial impacts for that pro forma. What you need to be watching, how that will work. It's a terrific overview. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Either those of you who are GMs of startup food co-ops that have not broken ground yet, but also for board members that will be overseeing the financial health of their co-op as this is unfolding, as their stores are actually being built. Then also in this time slot, we have raising money from owners during turbulent times. This is with Ben Sandell. He's going to talk about how we approach raising money from owners of our startup food co-ops when it might in some ways feel like almost the wrong time, when things like, a pandemic are happening and there's a great financial impacts. How do we wrap our minds around that actually, in some ways, there's never a better time to ask people to invest their money locally in a business that they own, that can make real impacts and differences right there in their community? How do we wrap our minds around that? And then how do we execute? How do we do that? And Ben will have some examples from 2 startups that he worked with during the pandemic that successfully raised owner loan capital. And also in this time slot, a new way of organizing community development partnerships. I'm excited about this one. This will be a panel discussion, and North Flint Food Market will be a part of it. The Gem City Market team will be a part of it, as well as the Detroit People's Food Co-op. And they're going to be talking about the decision in their communities that are, economically, that are low income, that are economically redlined communities that are attempting to work together to rebuild and control their community economically, bring food into their communities. How partnering with an existing development organization or nonprofit to develop the food co-op brought all sorts of new possibilities, brought in new capital in the form of talent, support, and financial capital, and how this might be a model moving into the future for those who are organizing in communities that are that have been economically oppressed. Some last thoughts that I will share with you. Share with your peers, learn from your peers. What it seemed like was solid, was the way we did things, at some point started to crumble. And startup food co-ops could have said, well, what they told us would work, it doesn't work anymore, and given up. But they didn't. What they told us works doesn't work in our community, and given up. They didn't. They innovated solutions. You know why the ground is so fertile right now? After that shakeup, after the tectonic plates moved? Because of you, because of your innovation, because of the amazing human capital, the amazing intelligence, talent, and dedication you brought to solving this problem. It was you, the startup organizers, that solved these gaps in what we used to think was the way to fund startup food co-ops. So you are the solution builders. You learn from one another. Share. Welcome in the experts to build solutions with you and at least start to test your new solutions. There's all sorts of possible new ways forward, and as has been demonstrated by co-op after co-op, we'll be talking to this afternoon, but it has to work. It has to still work in the realities, the financial realities of the model. And so make sure that you're testing those new ideas well with the experts. Financial capital is critical, and we didn't have time to talk about in depth today, but human capital is what leads to those solutions and leads to getting that financial capital. Don't underestimate it. Your capital plan must encompass your vision and the financial realities your business will be up against, both. Don't slack on either one. And there is no longer any cookie cutter way forward to financing your startup food co-op. No slam dunk. I cannot hand you a template and say it will go exactly like this. There are now multiple ways forward, but we know a lot about them, and you're going to hear all about them this afternoon. We can share with them, and again, keep learning from experts, from other startups, from your peers, but also keep innovating. And lastly, cooperation is always powerful and always worth it. The forms it takes are always changing, and that's part of its brilliance. We can't rely on just one way of doing things, but we can build multiple new, diverse ways forward together.